a Ukrainian invasion of Russian territory. That's at least what we've seen in the media. This and more in the Situation Report. There has been an attack in Bryansk. Forces with Ukrainian insignia crossed the border over into the Russian Federation over the internationally recognized border. We see here pictures they have published themselves. Two of the perpetrators, supposedly it was 4. We can at least confirm that it was at least 3, then, because obviously we have the guy taking the picture here and the 2 fighters. The interesting part is one of the persons has been identified. The person is Denis Kapustin. He's a Russian right-wing extremist that is living for a couple of years in Ukraine now and joined the Russian Volunteer Corps that is fighting on the side of Ukraine in the summer of 2022. His ideology is fairly interesting. He is opposing the Russian government and Putin because he wants a Russian ethno-state. So from how I understand it, purely Russians, and he wants the Romanovs, the Tsarist family, to return back into power. They crossed over to the border, and they have here a post in front of buildings that have been geolocated with the sign of their volunteer unit. And in the end, there was a claim that supposedly they killed some civilians. A video is surfacing, which unfortunately I can't really show you, of cars that have been shot off with corpses inside. Initially the reports were mentioning hostages as well as shooting a bus full of school children, killing civilians, etc. While the perpetrators here said in the video that they themselves are not there to harm children, to harm civilians, and you can see here the yellow armbands, so they marked themselves as Ukrainians while taking their pictures. If it is signed off by the Ukrainians, which these volunteer units have said so on their Telegram channel, they claimed that it's signed off by the Ukrainians, it would actually be kind of useful, as it would show the Russians that there is some danger coming over the border. While there have been talks that Russia might take this as a reason to declare war and general mobilization, this is probably nowhere close to what has happened before when it comes to urgency, to justification, to turn this into a fight for the motherland in any way. So this is overblown. But in which regard? It is important in the regard that it will show the Russians that they have to protect their whole border, basically the same as the Ukrainians have to do, thus fixing troops along the border that could be used otherwise. At the same time, there are claims that this was a false flag attack. I've read it both from Ukrainian sites as well as from a fairly well-known Twitter account that unfortunately is known for its exaggerated claims and some fantasy. But according to this, the FSB actually tried to do so. The latest thing was a combination of the two. The FSB wanted to do a false flag attack. Thus they ordered the border troops to leave to open a way for the FSB instigators. These Russian volunteer units fighting for Ukraine by accident apparently marched across the border while there were no border troops, and after they had and initially everyone thought, okay, so that's the anticipated FSB rate, it's just 2 hours early, and once that's why the claims were for kidnapping, for killed civilians, etc. And once they had left, they decided, okay, it wasn't us, so now we need to make it somewhat bigger. That whole claim sounds kind of ludicrous to me, to be perfectly honest. I'm just presenting it to you, and the source I have it from is not considered to be too reliable from my point of view. Generally, the story is interesting, though, especially if it leads the Russians to fix troops along the border here. We have now a video from the attack. No, not really from the attack. It's more like from a scouting raid Let me quickly speed it up. There's no need for us to waste too much time here. We see the drone flying on the airfield, on a drone flying on an airfield, and that's the airfield close to Minsk, where we see that there is actually the A-50, that basically Russian AVAX plane that has been attacked, according to reports. And we see somebody landing the drone on top of the radar dome without any problems. He's lifting off again. And apparently I think he tried again to land. Yeah, it should be in a second. And now he's flying away. So this video first surfaced and it felt like, where is this an attack? But it actually seems to have been a scouting mission, because now we have a second video that is basically showing the same thing. The same flight with a drone in, but this time we see it's from a different day. You see a little bit of snow here, and supposedly this ends. I can go forward a little, but the recording ends after it supposedly hit the, let's say, bulge here, which is the place where the satellite communication is in. So supposedly this was using this. The first video is a scout mission, which then was followed up after it has proven to be successful, because obviously if they get caught with just a drone without anything on it, it's probably far less punishing to the persons doing it than if the drone already has some explosives. But after they've seen that they can actually do it, they flew in a second one, and that supposedly carried bombs. The damage, though, can't have been too big. I've shown it in the last situation report, and now there are reports that the A-50 has actually flown away, so it's still airworthy. If the explosion happened on the satellite communication dome here, then obviously the damage will be much more substantial, and it will likely have to be, it will likely need substantial repairs, even though it might still be airworthy. When it comes to the front line, there is actually no real, let me quickly change this. There is no real changes along the whole front line here. The fighting is continuing. Concentration is still around Crimea, but there are reports of Ukrainian counterattacks in the region of Dvorichna, as well as in other parts of the area. Generally, the Russians seem to still dominate, but I cannot confirm any advances in territory over the last few days. South of the Siversky Donetsk, the fighting is also continuing. The fighting is continuing in the north too, even though it has died down mostly. In this area, the Russians are concentrating on Bakhmut and the immediate surroundings. There have been Russian successes in Subovo Vasilivka, which is here. I cannot confirm yet that it's captured, but the Russians have advanced in this direction, basically pushing further towards an encirclement, a full encirclement, and cutting off the troops within Bakhmut. In the eastern part of the city, the Russians have gained significant ground, and in Khomove, the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian General Staff is now reporting that it defeated Russian attacks. So from what we can see now, Khomove is probably, the road is probably still open, even though it is under pressure as well. There have also been attacks south in the direction of Ivanivsk along the front line here, but as we see now, they have not reached the street, the road, the T0405, that's this route here, this line of communication, so this should be more or less still open as well. The Ukrainians are now down to those two roads, both are under pressure, and it's a question of time, I guess, until when they are going to retreat. Generally, the Ukrainian side is verbally preparing for a withdrawal. We've heard it from several instances now, from several levels of government and military command, that a withdrawal from Bakhmut is well within the question. Even the Ukrainian president Zelensky himself said so as well, that they try to hold Bakhmut, but not at all costs. So a withdrawal, if it makes military sense, will happen. That would explain the gains in the eastern part of Bakhmut. That might be a partial withdrawal, and there are some reports of the Ukrainians having blown up several bridges, which would be another indication that they are preparing their final withdrawal, or at least to shrink the encirclement here, to shrink the area they are holding in Bakhmut, to make it less likely of being overrun and encircled. Generally, though, the question how long Bakhmut will hold out cannot really be answered, but its time seems to be running out. The Russians are now mostly pushing in the northern area, and they seem to be both pushing a little southwest to cut the lines of communications while they keep running on into the lines of the Ukrainians within Bakhmut itself. On the further south of it, we have fighting around Avdiivka, no confirmed changes. Fighting in Marinka, Russians claim gains in the north and in the south. I cannot confirm it, so no confirmed changes here. Fighting south of Vuhledar, but it seems to be positional, so no real advances there. Fighting is continuing, but no serious offensives in any ways. The front along the southern front seems to be mostly quiet, apart from artillery fire. Among that, for instance, S-300 being launched against cities, shelling of Kherson and other towns, so nothing has changed too much in this regard. On the Crimea, we have a picture now of the Russians removing a span of the Kerch railway bridge. It has obviously been seriously damaged, and they are now working on the repair of it. The damage, this threat here by Chris O, is telling in a way, and goes into the details of how the bridge is constructed, how heat sensitive it is, and for instance the videos here of the molten railway lines indicate how heavy the damage has been through the railway lines. But they are working on it now while the road bridge is already restored, and it seems to be in a matter of time now until the railroad bridge is back to full capacity as well. The Crimea, that's not all from Crimea though. The Russians are continuing to report Ukrainian attacks with drones on the peninsula. On the 1st of March alone, they claimed that they shot down 10 of them over the Crimea. When it comes to the mobilization, Putin has signed a decree that reduces the production of the Leader-class icebreaker that are equipped with nuclear power plants from 3 to 1 to reduce the costs, obviously, and to allow for more resources being used in the current war and its needs. But at the same time, the shipyard responsible for the building of nuclear submarines are saying that they are going to reduce the production time for roughly a year. So the production of nuclear power plants should be increased, which doesn't really fit to it because the necessity for nuclear power plants isn't really a priority for this war. Wagner, the PMC, seems to be intending to start recruiting in sports clubs. They supposedly have opened a couple of recruiting stations. There are some questions, some rumors that this might mean they're going to recruit minors, teenagers for their units, but there is no proof whatsoever for this, that this might actually lead to it. We will keep an eye on it, try to find out more about it, but it's too early to actually accuse Wagner to use minors in this regard. And we've seen another interesting picture here of videos and pictures appearing from a new modification the Russians are using in the war. That's an old MTLB, which is like a lightly armored transport vehicle, and they've actually built a turret on it, which is a anti-air gun turret from developed after World War II for ships with two 25mm guns that they are apparently modifying now to use along the front lines in Ukraine. The criminal prosecution in Russia is adjusted right now for the discrediting of fighters. If you discredit fighters, you are now under threat of a fine of 5 million ruble. That's approximately $66,000 or 5 years in a prison camp in a forced labor camp, or 15 years of prison itself. That should help to get the criticism of the war under control, and will obviously put pressure on the military bloggers to hold back with their criticism. The head of the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, Kirilo Budanov, was saying is saying that the Russians are massively arresting civilians to use them as prisoners of war. Supposedly 40% of all persons that the Russians are claiming are prisoners of war are in reality children, including women and children. And they want to exchange basically civilians for soldiers when it comes to the exchanges with Ukraine. The Serbian President Vučić has said that Serbs who have fought with Wagner and are returning to Serbia will be arrested and prosecuted. This is angering the Russian sphere, as well as now Serbian MLRS rockets for the BM-21 Grad system have appeared in Ukraine. They are actually extended range, so they are significantly better what Ukraine had so far. And there is some claims that a Serbian factory has sold 3,500 of those rockets to Ukraine, even though it's not clear whether they knew it was going to Ukraine or if it was going through some middlemen. And CNN was publishing an article about systematic torture in Kherson that has been identified. Basically, they are saying the first stage essentially is to detain and, in many instances, kill a category of people labeled as leaders, meaning those who could physically resist the occupation, but also those who could culturally resist it. And in the second phase, they would then deport and torture persons that are resisting but are not considered to be leaders. In Kherson, they identified at least 20 facilities for widespread torture of Ukrainian citizens. All of this showing again basically what is justified, what is identified internationally as the attempt of genocide within Ukraine by the Russian government. When it comes to the international support, we have an interesting video here that I'm going to let you listen to, because it shows what actually is not too much of a surprise, but still kind of new. But I'll just play it for you.
Some of the Ukrainian armed forces have operated tanks before, but most of them have not seen a tank.
But getting to...
So, unlike we heard in the past, these are not necessarily all tank soldiers, but Britain is currently training soldiers that have not been tank crews before to run the Challenger 2 MBTs, and the training will only be several weeks. Obviously, that shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because how many tank crews can Ukraine have in spare without having tanks? So at some point, it was bound to happen that Ukraine will send or will have to train new personnel to start up from training. That some of them are experienced might probably or hopefully mean that at least the commanders are experienced tank crews, which will probably mitigate the lack of knowledge and doctrine and other things when it comes to drivers, gunners, etc. But generally it shows that Ukraine will likely use tanks with tank crews with only a few weeks of training when it comes to fighting the Russians now. And this was it already for today's situation report. Tell me what you think. Do you think the Ukrainian forces should stage more cross-border raids? And do you think this is useful or can be harmful? If you liked what I do, please hit the like button. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And this channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already doing this. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.